Welcome to the second segment of the two-part workshop on noticing and recasts from the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University. In the first segment, Kate White and Sylvia Kunitz introduced you to the concept of noticing in cognition and in interaction. In this second segment, Kate and Sylvia will show how noticing may be triggered by one type of corrective feedback, recasts. You will also hear from the language teachers who attended the workshop as they discuss noticing, recasts, and how these topics relate to their teaching practices.
Types of corrective feedback, just an overview. I'm going to define them on this slide and give examples on the next slide. So explicit corrections are when you clearly indicate that the utterance was incorrect and also provide the correct form. So you say no and then give the correct form, right? So recast, which is what we're focusing on, you don't clearly indicate that it was incorrect, but you also provide the correct form. Prompts are when you don't provide the correct form, but you make it clear that something was wrong and that the student should self-repair somehow, right? And there are others: clarification request, metalinguistic clues, and repetition. An example in English, one of the last things people acquire is the S in the third person singular, right? So a student might say, he say yes, which is incorrect obviously. An explicit correction would be, no, not say, he says yes. I told you it's wrong and I gave you the correct form, right? A recast would just be, he says yes, right? That's it. All you do is provide the correct form, you reformulate it for them, you don't indicate that it was wrong. A prompt, making it clear that something was wrong and that you're waiting for them to give you some sort of response, right? A prompt is a type of elicitation. Clarification request, he what? So you make it clear again that something was wrong, but you want them to give you the correct form. A metalinguistic cue is when you draw their attention to the rule, right? So what is the third person singular of say? And then they say, he says, hopefully. And then repetition, he say yes, making it clear again that there's something wrong and that they should fix it. So these are the different types of corrective feedback that people have studied and researched to sort of look at the outcome and whether or not they're effective.
Given these examples of types of corrective feedback, think again of your own teaching. What types of corrective feedback do you use? Do you prefer some over others? Why? Now that you've reflected on your own teaching, let's hear what some of the teachers had to say about their use of corrective feedback.
And then the next slide. So I want you to think about, is there a type of corrective feedback that you think you use more frequently? And is there a specific rationale that guides you in the use of one type of feedback over another?
And I think for me, they have different places in the classroom. For instance, I am more active at trying to make them produce a correct form if that is the topic of that class.
Exactly. Could even think about when they are talking in class, should we be giving them feedback at that point? So if they are having an interaction, if they are talking in a more free way, should we even think about giving them feedback about grammar, vocabulary?
If we're just focusing on form, then I think it's fine if you just correct them.
Choosing which mistakes to correct and which ones to let go, you know. I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, that's really hard.
So maybe something that doesn't impair the communication, like if they're trying to get an idea across,
Right.
you let it go, unless it's something that is important in your program.
Right. Or maybe just focus on the on the things, on the structures you're just working on right now.
I think it's very different, the type of feedback. I use a lot of recasts. I think the recasts are good because you don't interrupt the interaction that you are having with the student. So if the student is telling you something and you are kind of in that kind of trying to understand and respond to what the student is saying, if you kind of stop the student and say, you know what, you are not pronouncing the word right here, or you just say, repeat after me, and make the student repeat the right thing, the purpose of the meaning is completely gone and the interaction is completely interrupted. We cannot go back to that point. So I think the recast is really important because you kind of make the correction become part of the interaction. So I use that a lot.
So, but yeah, it's a delicate balance to not overdo it and to be able to be flexible. And then you just get comfortable. I mean, there's the one way that I'm more comfortable doing this. I have to sort of remind myself that different
Yeah,
students.
be more aware of each situation and what would be the most effective way for each situation, for each.
Yeah, because you get comfortable and you just kind of go along. Right?
Yes, and I think, yes, each person has their habits,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very difficult to. It's something so natural, so you don't even think
Right, you're just
about
doing
it.
it.
You do it. You don't stop and say, okay, which one? I have these options. Do I do?
But it's important because sometimes we are just not doing things in the most effective way.
Now, Kate and Sylvia will focus on one type of corrective feedback, recasts. Let's see how these relate to noticing.
So we're going to talk about recasts specifically. Recasts are reformulations of erroneous utterances in which the teacher provides the correct utterance. So recasts and noticing. Do they notice them? Learners must notice recasts as corrective in order for them to be effective, right? If you recast and they don't realize there was a problem, they'll just blow past and go, uh-huh, and then keep talking, right? Because recasts are not always salient. So they have to notice the recast, register that it is corrective, and then notice the gap between what they have and what the target language form is in order for it to be effective in its full sense. This is where we talk about uptake, because uptake is where we find the evidence of the effectiveness of the recast. So it's the turn in which learners indicate whether they have noticed the recast or not. Or not, they might indicate with their uptake that they didn't notice it at all. So if they go, uh-huh, and then keep going and don't correct it, then maybe they didn't notice it, and we don't know, right? They might not have noticed it at all. So uptake is not conclusive evidence for noticing the recast, but it is where we look.
Do your students always notice corrective feedback? Let's hear from the teachers on this topic.
Today I noticed a time when I did a recast for a student, and that had no effect whatsoever. The student didn't acknowledge. He didn't even notice, or he did, but he didn't show it. So he did acknowledge because he said yes and continued, but didn't incorporate what I had said.
And after the workshop, I was also thinking, oh my gosh, do my students actually get what I'm trying to do here, or correct them, or do they actually get the correction? But I have to say that sometimes actually they repeat what I say and they notice something. But what I also do, I use the recast, but then also go to the whiteboard and actually write something on the board.
I mean, how do you make sure that the students are paying attention to that particular aspect that you want to focus on?
The student repeating the correct form, is that really proof that he actually acknowledges?
But of course, then we have the issue that we never know if the student noticed that. So most of the time, if the student doesn't repeat or doesn't give you any information about how much he understood, or if he even noticed that was a correction and not a repetition, it's hard. So we have to find other ways.
I know that I use recasts a lot no matter what year, so in first and in second year. But I think if I see that the student doesn't get it, so when I see that, I'm like, okay, they didn't get it, and I'm getting more explicit. But sometimes if there's no reaction at all, it makes it really hard, like it is true. So I mean, what do you do then? Do I really need to go into more detail, or do they really get it? It's really hard to say. But
As the teachers say, it can be difficult to help students when you can't tell if they notice corrective feedback. So where do we look for evidence of noticing? As Kate says, when we need to find evidence of noticing, we can turn to conversation analysis and look for evidence in conversational data. Let's look at some examples with Sylvia.
What we really want is evidence. Evidence that they noticed it, evidence that it worked, right? So where do we find the evidence of noticing with corrective feedback? Uptake. Uptake, exactly. So uptake is a report of what learners noticed or paid attention to during a teacher's instruction. Unless you somehow establish what uptake looks like in a brain imaging study and attach sensors to their brain every time they're in class, or use eye tracking maybe, then this is where we find it. So that's when you want to talk to conversation analysts.
Okay, so here we are in Sweden. This is an EFL classroom. They are going over classroom objects. It's a vocabulary class. Now I'm gonna have you listen to the audio just of the relevant bit where the recast is. The audio is from the students' table, so it's a little bit better. You can hear what the students are actually saying.
What's this then?
Oh, the puncher.
This was a puncher. Yes, a punch. That's right.
Okay, so what happens? The teacher is showing a punch, and she's asking, what is it? Okay, what's this then? So Hannah, one of the students, raises her hand, and Tim looks at Hannah. And then there is a little bit of competition here to get the floor. But ultimately, after the teacher in line 9 repeats the question, what do you call this? It's Tim who produces the answer, puncher. Okay, clearly incorrect. But Hannah accepts it. Okay, so his group mate accepts it and raises her hand higher. So the teacher says, Hannah, and Hannah dutifully repeats what Tim said and she accepted. It was a puncher. Then both the students look at the teacher and the teacher says, yes. And then, so a positive evaluation of what they said. And here, again, image blurred. So this is Hannah and this is Tim. Right in the moment when the teacher is producing the recast, a punch, and so he's immediately orienting to the positive evaluation issued by the teacher. It's like, hey, I was right. See, I was right, because ultimately, you know, it was Tim who suggested that word, not Hannah. It was Hannah who delivered it to the class, but it was Tim who produced it in the first place. So exactly in this moment, you have Tim doing that gesture. The teacher hopelessly, well, you can figure where this is going, right? Showing the punch, a punch. Not only, so at this point, you have Hannah shifting her gaze to Tim. And sure enough, hey, that's right, give me 5. We got the right thing, okay? So they're totally not orienting to the corrective import of the recast, okay? Evidence of not learning. 5 weeks later, written translation task. So this is the Swedish word for punch, and Hannah writes puncher. So at least she learned the word puncher. And Tim, on the other hand, uses the same form, but for stapler. Some confusion. So what do we learn? The recast is embedded in positive evaluations. So it's kind of confusing, okay? If you say yes, produce a recast, produce another, yes, that's right. Oh my God, the student doesn't know what's going on, okay? So you're not really giving your student a great chance of noticing the corrective import of the recast. Clearly, like in this case, if the recast is embedded in positive evaluations, the students, in this case, I'm not saying that it's true in general, you know, but if we look at an example like this one, you can clearly see how the student is orienting to the positive evaluation of the answer. The other issue is, can they actually hear it? Okay, punch, puncher, who knows, okay? And as I said, a closed multimodal analysis can actually help in looking at how participation frameworks change and also how attention allocation changes, okay? Depending on who you orient to, also your attention shifts, okay? You're attending to something else, okay? So it's the teacher-student phase of a multi-part oral exam.
Ok, bene, hai detto che ti piace ascoltare la musica. Che musica ti piace ascoltare?
L'opera per Verdi e Puccini e Mozart.
Benissimo, perché tu studi?
Sì, io cantare.
Okay, so the teacher is asking a follow-up question. You said you like listening to music. Yes. Which music do you like listening to? The opera. Then Frank expands on his answer. The teacher accepts this, positive evaluates the student's answer. Then she further elaborates by asking yet another question, because you study music, right? And Frank says, I to sing. Okay, so io cantare. So you have the personal pronoun and the verb in the infinitive form. Oh boy, verbs need to be conjugated. But for now, nobody is orienting to this as a problem, right? Teacher is nodding, saying, okay. Student is also nodding, okay, we're doing good here. That's good. It's an oral exam. So far, so good. And as they are nodding to each other, basically, whoops, correction, okay? Also, it's interesting to see that, again, it's done in a lower volume. So to me, it's kind of like, and again, I'm over-interpreting, it's kind of like the teacher couldn't resist. So she had to fix that. This is not that phase. This is the phase when the teacher is supposed to just chat with the student, okay? But sure enough, she produces a correction. And it's a very specific type of correction because she is producing the accurate verb form from her point of view, using, okay? So the message basically is boy. The verbs need to be conjugated, right? Okay. But again, positive evaluation. And oops, Frank says the magic. Oh, okay, so possibly there is some noticing. I mean, possibly, what I'm saying with the O is that possibly the O might be capturing the moment of the actual perceptual noticing. Possibly, okay? It's all to be demonstrated, and probably nobody will ever be able to demonstrate it, but it's possibly one of the moments when the perceptual noticing actually emerges, okay? So, oh, and then there you go, the verb conjugated in the right form, okay? So what do we learn from this example? We learned that in this case too, the correction was embedded in positive evaluations. So it's pretty much like the other case, but in this case, magically, the student's oriented to that, okay? Oriented to the corrective import of the teacher's correction. So he self-corrects, and so we looked at two examples of recasts or corrections embedded in positive evaluations. Could the larger activity matter? This is an oral exam. So probably the second one, the successful example with Frank. Positively, probably that matters, okay? Because it's an oral exam and students can be concerned with accuracy, okay?
As Sylvia has demonstrated, students may not always respond to recasts with uptake. Let's listen as the teachers discuss how this could be addressed and how noticing could be encouraged more in the classroom.
Once you're aware and once you notice as a teacher the way students react or not to your feedback, you could actually be more productive. And
so I guess that we need to do something besides just the recast, because obviously the students are not getting it just by recasting. So what are some of the things that we can do? It's not a question of let's not do recast anymore, I think it's a question of let's follow up the recast with something,
Right,
even if it's not right then and there, but let's retake it and let's have the students notice it and work on it.
Is that I make a list of the main mistakes, and I usually spend like 20 minutes of the following class like writing sentences or parts of their own production on the board and making them reflect about what they did. So we kind of do the correction part together as a group.
Incorrect. What about allowing another student to give correction? That's a little delicate, but I still think could be effective if you allow the student to rethink, but the student cannot come up with a form.
And then open it for the whole class.
Right now we know what is noticing, and then I think I would like to know what can we do to make students notice more, and what can we do to make the result more effective, and how do we know it is effective?
How do I convert that noticing into the process of really using that in their output, for instance, or incorporating that in their output?
But we want to know more about how to make our activities and our classes more efficient and effective for that. So knowing, okay, I have this material, but many times I don't know how to work with it to really help my students process that information. So I don't know so much about language acquisition and how really the process works. So I think I would like to know more about that in specific ways, maybe ways that are more that facilitate the learning, ways that are not that good. I don't know.
And feedback and assessment are, we talked a lot about feedback, but I mean, we could go to the next level and go to assessment and how to link feedback and assessment, because many times we use assessment to kind of judge them, but not really in a way of giving them feedback about what they are doing. So how to convert assessment in a way of not only giving them a grade, but also converting those activities into a way of giving them feedback and improving what they already know.
In this second segment of the mini workshop, Kate and Sylvia introduced some different types of corrective feedback and discussed how recasts can encourage students noticing. They and the teachers also discussed the difficulty of finding evidence of noticing without uptake. Sylvia showed some examples in which we looked for evidence of noticing in interaction. The teachers then discussed ways to encourage noticing with feedback. How can you encourage noticing in your classroom? Thank you for watching this workshop from the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University.